I'm going to do the US version of Mr. Noisy. It's the US version read by Mr. Noisy and Rolf the Dog's World 1976. That's me. So I'm going to read it on my own. Hope I'll laugh through it. So, I'll get started. Mr. Noisy was indeed a very, very noisy person. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. At the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts with Mr. Noisy asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on the top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, this is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of running elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock rang. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above Wobbletown wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Go, go, go. He walked into the bakery shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb the baker. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher's shop. Go, go, go. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crashed with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled, a small smile, which grew to a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you found the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy went down to Wobbletown to shop again. Go, go, go. He went into Mrs. Crumb's bakery shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread. Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. So, Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's butcher shop again. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Folks, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed that night, hungry. The next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's bakery shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started screaming at the very top of his lungs. A loaf of, and then he stopped. And then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Certainly, she said with a smile. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's butcher shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, screamed Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his lungs. I said I'd like And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off for home up the hill. And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never ever tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. Mr. Noisy arrived at his house door. He passed hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were the two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. They were fun too. And then, do you know something? Mr. Noisy isn't as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted. Especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has even learned how to whisper. Come on. Craziness Richard Epcar is not for crazy. Should this ever happen?